Captain Midnight.
Just so you know, there will be spoilers. So, there's a moment in Disney Plus's new Peter Pan and Wendy where Wendy tries to look through one of the Lost Boys' telescopes, and she's unable to see the pirate ship that the rest of the kids do, because she's a little older than them and has a harder time tapping into the childhood magic of Neverland. It's only when she's able to accept the childish and absurd and look through the telescope backwards that it finally works. The more I thought about the movie, the more I kind of came to believe that the film itself almost feels like it's in the same situation, where it feels the very adult logic-driven need to psychologically deepen the characters of Peter Pan and Captain Hook, giving Hook a tragic backstory and explaining away elements of plot that were better left to fairy tale logic and subtext. But at the same time, it's hard to fault the movie for at least trying its own thing and not just adhering to a near shot-for-shot remake of the 1953 animated musical. Because this movie, whatever its faults, is still a much more interesting watch than the ugly, emotionless retread of The Lion King. Now, that being said, and I'm sorry to be so back and forth about this, but its new elements didn't manage to make Peter Pan and Wendy feel super fresh or surprising either. I mean, really, how could they? The film industry has been churning out live-action movies based on J.M. Barrie's 1911 Peter Pan story since its earliest days. Paramount Pictures released a silent film adaptation in 1924, and that trend has never totally let up. It was less than 10 years ago that Warner Brothers released the Joe Wright-directed Pan, that big-budget reimagining that is probably most remembered today for Hugh Jackman singing a Nirvana song as a pirate in it. That is a strange, strange movie. But it's also just the tip of the iceberg. You have the bolder, slightly darker take, just called Peter Pan from 2003. Keira Knightley played Tinkerbell in a sci-fi miniseries that recast the Lost Boys as London pickpockets in 2011. Girls Allison Williams played Peter Pan in a live stage performance on NBC in 2014. And going back a little more, there's of course Hook, which is either an unimpeachable childhood classic or one of Steven Spielberg's worst movies, depending on who you ask. My point being that this very simple children's story has been examined, re-examined, and reimagined so many times that it's a very tough concept to bring something new to. And that's made even more difficult by the fact that this is the Disney version, which means that it has to tap into all the specific iconography and music of the 50s movie. Otherwise, it may as well just be another Pan, and I'm pretty sure that's not what Disney wanted Green Knight director David Lowery to deliver.
There's a land you've always believed in, a boy who's never grown up, and an all-new movie coming only to theaters.
So from the very start, Peter Pan and Wendy had a steep uphill battle that I'm not sure it would have ever been able to really overcome. And look, some people are probably going to hate the next thing I'm about to say, but I should also mention I think the original animated Peter Pan is one of the weaker entries in Disney's animated classics era. There are some really great things about it. The iconic first flight scene is incredible. I love Captain Hook and Peter's Errol Flynn-inspired sword fights. And, of course, the scene stealer himself, Mr. Smee. But I think it lacks the lush, incredible animation of Sleeping Beauty a few years later, and it feels very by the numbers and safe compared to what the studio was accomplishing a decade and change earlier with movies like Fantasia and Pinocchio. So for me, it's just kind of a shame that David Lowery, who showed off a skill at staging these otherworldly fantastical scenes in Green Knight, is saddled with having to recreate the safest possible interpretation of this material. Now, there are scenes that I think work here, like the more surreal crossover into Neverland after the kids fly through Big Ben, but they end up feeling like frustrating suggestions of the creativity that could have been on display if they didn't have to tie it in visually with the cartoon. And what really sucks is that I don't think people who actually want a faithful remake of that movie will like this one very much either. It tries to split the difference between being a Lion King-like remake and doing its own thing. And as a result, I'm not sure it'll fully satisfy people who would want one or the other. In a lot of ways, Peter Pan and Wendy tries to make this story its own, and I can respect that. But Peter Pan has always been about growing up, about the push and pull between leaving childhood fun and innocence behind and taking on the inevitable, sometimes scary responsibilities of becoming an adult. This new movie is very much about that as well, spelling out that theme maybe even more than the 50s film did. But despite all the new plot mechanics that attempt to double down on the idea, I think it has absolutely nothing to say about it that hasn't been said better and with far more emotional impact in other Peter Pan adaptations. On the surface, the movie seems like it's trying to give Wendy a bigger role in the story, and in some ways it does. In this version, she saves herself from walking the plank, tapping into Tinkerbell's magic. Her nervousness over leaving home for a boarding school is the focus of the pre-Neverland scenes, and she has a lot more dialogue with Captain Hook as well. But I would argue that the Darling family, Wendy included, have rarely been less important to the story than they are here. By pushing Peter and Captain Hook's tragic origin story to the forefront of the movie, most of the subtext about the Hook character is drained away. There's a tradition when staging the original play that was carried over to the animated film, where the actor that plays George Darling, Wendy's banker father, plays Captain Hook as well, suggesting, without outright stating it in some boring literal way like I'm about to, that the Darling kids are using this world of make-believe to unknowingly deal with their own conflicted feelings about their parent and authority figure. There's an understandable dreamlike logic to it, a concept that Spielberg plays with pretty effectively in Hook, which is far more directly about fatherhood. All of that is thrown out the window in Peter Pan and Wendy, which instead focuses on Hook and Peter's past. Here, Hook was once a childhood friend of Peter's in Neverland, until he had to leave because he missed his mom so much, only to return as an angry adult, hellbent on defeating Peter and driving all the children out of Neverland. Now, to the movie's credit, Jude Law plays this material far better than it deserves. There's a scene late into the film that sees Hook talking to a captured Wendy on his boat about how he's resigned himself to this life of disappointment and anger, where you're really reminded that, oh yeah, Jude Law is like a fantastic actor who should be in more current stuff that isn't straight to Disney Plus movies. The script gives Hook less scenery-chewing material than you'd probably expect based on the cartoon or even his over-the-top introduction, but everything Law is called upon to do, he does really well, trying his best to elevate this script as best he can. If there's one reason to see this movie, it's him. The kids are mostly well cast too. The Lost Boys barely get anything to do beyond exposition, but they're fine. Now the Darling boys get far less here to do than usual, and they mostly just fade into the background. Wendy, as played by Mila Jovovich's daughter Ever Anderson, is able to hold her own against Law in scenes, and is solid in what actually ended up being a pretty thankless role. But it's Peter Pan himself that's an issue. I feel bad singling out a kid actor here, and this is only his second live-action film or TV credit apparently, but Alexander Maloney plays Peter Pan in a way that feels very high school play. To be fair to him, this script puts him in a very tough spot. He's expected to play both the traditional Peter Pan, shouting tally-ho and doing old-fashioned sword fight banter, while also having to handle these more subdued emotional scenes where he admits to turning his back on his best friend decades ago in his sad, ageless past. There are scenes between him and Jude Law where Law is bringing his A game, trying to convince us that these two are both the oldest of friends and obsessive enemies, where Maloney is just not up to the task and feels very wooden in comparison. And again, he's not helped by the fact that this script sporadically makes Peter feel like a moody cult leader before reverting him back to his Disney cartoon self. There's other characters I should probably mention, like Tinkerbell, Tiger Lily, and Mr. Smee, but their roles feel so inconsequential here that they don't really seem worth it.
Wow, you can see how much more you get in the big 18-ounce jar.
I gotta say, with Tinkerbell especially, I'm pretty disappointed with Lowery. From his previous work, I'd assume he'd come up with some really creative ways to use her visually, but that just didn't happen. I actually thought Yara Shahidi was really charming in the role, but she never feels connected to the actors at all. She doesn't really get to interact with them in a meaningful way. And they also drop her rivalry with Wendy, which diminishes a lot of what made that character memorable. There's no inspired idea to replace it either, she's just far less of a presence. Then there's the very odd musical numbers. While the score gives us new versions of the expected classics like You Can Fly, characters don't actually sing them, which is an understandable choice, but the weird thing here is that there are still some musical numbers. mostly from Hook's crew, who do a couple original sea shanty type songs. I actually liked the second pirate song quite a bit, honestly, but the rest don't make much of an impression at all. And overall, it just feels like this strange half measure where the movies want to remind you of the musical elements of the original, nod to them, and dip a toe in doing their own songs while never fully committing to any one approach. It's just weird that this many remakes in, Disney still have no idea how to approach the musical aspect of so many of these movies. Peter Pan and Wendy isn't a train wreck. It's mostly just kind of there. It even has a few inspired moments, but it's also weighed down by being both yet another Peter Pan movie and a quasi-remake of the most famous Peter Pan movie. The result is pretty bland, but not the kind of blandness that I think is going to hit people's nostalgia buttons all that well either. I've liked Lowery's work in the past, and even his previous Disney remake, Pete's Dragon, which is about as good as these remakes have yet to get. But Peter Pan and Wendy can't hit that mark. It's more or less exactly what I thought it would be when it was announced. It's just a movie that felt doomed to mediocrity from the beginning.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes, too.